Hello everyone and welcome to InnovaHealth Talk Live. I am Tiffany Chenier, Manager of Investor Relations at InnovaHealth Partners, leading growth investors in the medical technology sector. Thank you for participating with us today to join a conversation with Dr. Toby Cosgrove, our Senior Advisor and Partner, and Tim Berkowitz, our President and CEO, about the COVID-19 era we are now in and its impact on medtech innovation and growth. Before we get started, let me say a few words about this webinar and provide some background. To budget your time, we believe this conversation should take about 45 minutes, including questions and answers. This webinar is being recorded for our investors, advisors, and management partners so that we can provide a playback exclusively for their use. Your participation implies your consent to our recording this webcast and to its confidentiality. The audience has been placed on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box on your screen. We will endeavor to reply during the question and answer period at the end of this meeting. With the success of our annual meeting webinar in late April, when over 75% of our limited partners and advisors located in the US, Europe, and Asia joined us, we felt that it would be valuable to build off of their enthusiastic response and on the conversations and questions that were raised there by holding this event for you. Much has happened in the past 10 weeks, and even in the past 7 since our annual meeting. Again, we are very pleased to engage with you here, especially with the insight and perspective that Dr. Cosgrove and Tim Berkowitz will provide, some of which key off of their remarks at our annual meeting. Tim, may I turn it over to you?
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Hello to you all. You are a global audience today, and so I should add good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for this session, and for those of you who are abroad. Operating in the early phases of this pandemic, all of us thirsted for knowledge and understanding of COVID-19's impact on our lives, and of how it impacted those around us, and of course in the medtech field. The response at our annual meeting only underscored to you how important it is to stay very connected, and we're responding to that. Here we are 7 weeks after our annual meeting, and who would have guessed that the abrupt bear market we faced would have a market that would be at the same level today as it was on January 1st, characterized by a rapid recovery in the financial markets, both equity and fixed income. It has definitely been a stimulus-driven market. With massive unemployment numbers in the US today, even if we're starting to see some positive signs of reemployment, we believe this market appears to be very fully priced in this environment. I would say the big issue is of course the difficult earnings and growth picture that we're facing, at least in the short term for industry generally, and probably lasting another year or two. With real rates near or below zero across developed markets, we remain convinced that our focus on medtech with its high growth and recession-resistant characteristics remains extremely attractive. These qualities are increasingly rare in this new economic environment that is starved for real growth. Notably, in 2020, expected growth for large cap medtech companies is approximately 6% compared to negative real earnings growth rates for the S&P 500. As a result, our industry continues to outperform the broader healthcare market and the S&P. And when tied to high valuations in the public markets, we believe our private equity growth strategy represents a lower risk and high growth alternative to the public markets. Our annual meeting themes focused heavily on how medical technology remains a high growth industry over the long term, whether it addresses elective or non-elective surgical needs. And that is especially so in the highly innovative sectors that we're investing in. We're focused on large industry segments and acquiring controlling stakes in independent companies that become compelling acquisition targets for the many global corporate buyers. that need innovation. Given that we take execution risk, not the innovation risk, not the technology risk, I should say, in our companies, they need to be led by strong management teams who understand how to inspire organizations, do so with integrity, and create value even in volatile times like this. In working closely with Toby Cosgrove over the last year, I've learned that no one knows more about how innovation will drive better outcomes and results for all participants, both patients, hospitals, and all parties in the healthcare arena. Before we start our conversation here with Toby, let me properly introduce him to you. Toby. He spent most of his career, as many of you know, at the Cleveland Clinic, where he performed over 22,000 heart surgeries and earned an international reputation for innovation. Chaired the Department of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery from 1989 to 2004. And he holds 30 patents, I should say, for medical technologies and devices particularly, and played a vital role in creating the Cleveland Clinic Innovations Group. In 2004, became CEO of the Cleveland Clinic and was responsible for monumental change in the organization by significantly improving clinical outcomes and focusing on the patient experience. It's also responsible for the overall growth in the clinic's footprint, where it owns 17 hospitals in the state of Ohio, where it's the largest private employer, as well as the states of Florida and Nevada, as well as hospitals in Toronto, Abu Dhabi, and soon London. Toby, thank you for joining us today. Since your arrival at the firm in 2019, you've been serving on our investment committee and been responsible for sourcing investments, supporting clinical due diligence, deepening our relationships with strategic acquirers and financial institutions around the world. You've really gotten into the mix, and I'm very grateful for your involvement. I think all of my partners are, especially during this remarkable and volatile time we're living in, which has deep long-term implications for how medtech innovation and growth should be understood. I want to turn to you now and really ask you the question that's on everyone's mind, which is really, when is the COVID nightmare going to be over? Such as it.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be able to talk with all of you. Really, this is a whole new era, new reality that we're dealing with. First of all, there's no cure currently. We do not have a vaccine, and the prospects of a vaccine being widely available is probably not going to be for at least a year. Then we don't know what immunity from a vaccine would be like. And also, we know that not everybody is going to take the vaccine once it's offered. About 30% of the population in the United States, when surveyed, said that they would not take a vaccine initially when it was offered, which does mean that there's going to be a residual of people who are going to continue to be potentially infected and a residual of infection. Now, the other thing I think we have to remember is there's only been one in the history of viruses that has completely been eliminated from the earth, and that's smallpox. We continue to have diseases such as polio in small areas where that continues to be rampant, but we have not eliminated anything but smallpox. So we are going to most probably be continuing to live with this COVID-19 virus for as long as we can imagine into the future. So as Lincoln said when he addressed the Congress during the Civil War, he said, we have to think anew and act anew. So we have to learn how to function and live with this virus for the rest of our lives, and we're going to be part of the post-COVID era, and it's going to change almost everything about how we live and how we work. Tim, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you. what is this going to mean, Toby, in terms of the healthcare delivery and the regulatory environment?
Well, this has been absolutely devastating to healthcare providers. Just to give you some idea of the magnitude of the issue, hospitals have been under tremendous financial stress. The Cleveland Clinic in 1 month lost $100 million, and it's recently been reported that hospitals across the United States are losing $1.4 billion a day. And this has had enormous effects. Similarly, physicians have been, many of them have been completely out of work as offices have been closed. Many elective procedures have not been done. So this is going to change that perception of how hospitals are run. You have to remember that hospitals started out this with 20% of the hospitals in the United States running in the red. And the margin for a hospital that is doing well is about 2 to 3%. So we know that we are, as an industry, financially on a nice edge, if you will. I think as this happens, we're going to see more hospitals fail. Some of them will close, and I think there'll be a major consolidation of hospitals coming out of this. Similarly, I think that physicians now, with 65% of the physicians in the United States currently being employed, this trend is going to continue as physicians realize in private practice they are vulnerable, and they were going to form larger groups or be employed by hospitals. Now that has ramifications, I think, for the medtech industry, because there'll be fewer decision makers as we go forward, which will allow new technologies to be introduced with contacting fewer people rather than having to contact huge numbers of individuals who make decisions. Similarly, I think that hospitals are going to be looking for new sources of income, and they're going to be looking for more efficient ways to deliver care. And that will have an effect on who delivers the care, where the care is delivered, and how the care is delivered. All have major implications. We've also seen there has been a huge change in how the FDA has looked at regulations. They have majorly reduced regulations and getting new products to market and sped things along, which is a very positive sign. And similarly, there have been changes like doctors being able to practice across state lines. And this hopefully will not be reversed as we go forward. I think this is a great opportunity to reduce the amount of regulations and free up the healthcare industry, which, as you know, is very highly regulated.
Yeah. No, thank you. Can we turn to patient care and how these factors are going to impact the average patient in this country?
Yeah, well, Lennon said that there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. We've certainly lived in that era over the last several weeks. Just to give you an example of that, telehealth at the Cleveland Clinic went from 2% of the visits to 75% of the visits in a matter of weeks. The diabetic patients, 94% of those were treated with telehealth. Now, interestingly, as the hospitals have started to reopen, it is now shrunk down to 27%, but I think there's no question that we're going to see a change in how healthcare is delivered and how that happens. Now, what that means is that hospitals the industry will be less hospital-centric, and we're going to see more and more efforts to try, if you will, to democratize the delivery of healthcare. Telehealth is one of the ways to do that. I think you're seeing the same thing done with the delivery of drugs and prescribing. And we will see movements to outpatient facilities and clearly less invasive procedures as you move to outpatients. Similarly, there's going to be a big movement towards home care, much of which can be facilitated with telehealth. Now, the other major thing that's happened is people have stayed away from healthcare in groves. Recently, the data would suggest that there's been a 45% decrease in diagnosis of cancer. a 38% decrease in the admissions for heart attacks, a 30% decrease in the admissions for a stroke. And if you look at the data coming out of New York City, it would suggest that the increased mortality rate has been 40% of that has been related to standard diseases like heart attacks and stroke, etc. So then further supporting this is we now find that there's been a 40% decrease in patients coming to the emergency room, all of which I think is going to give us a tremendous pent-up demand for services. And what people are now seeing is that there is a huge increase in the severity of people coming to the emergency room. And this pent-up demand is going to really tax healthcare in the future. Hospitals are now have maintained a safety, and they are now open for business. The Cleveland Clinic, for example, has now gone from the expected 25,000 outpatient visits a year or a day to 21,000. About 80% return to both hospitalization and outpatient visits. So the changes in healthcare, I think, have been amazing, and how it's delivered, where, and ultimately by whom.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. What all of this has to mean, and I should phrase this as a real question, is how it will impact medical technology, the growth companies that are particularly of interest, the huge number of smaller and middle market companies that are trying to navigate through these factors that you've just described. Could you speak to that, Toby?
Yeah, well, you never want to waste a great crisis. And this crisis has given a time for companies to take a time out and to rethink how they're organizing themselves going forward. I think two examples of this might be Coelis and Radiaction, two of the companies which we're invested in. Coelis is a prostate biopsy and diagnosis company. And what they have done is taken the time to reach out to urologists all over the world via webinars, and have educated as many as 400 physicians at one swoop in ways that they never could have before. Radiaction, on the other hand, is taking this opportunity to better align its approach to the FDA for approval, and they have been able to attract a lot of talent that has been unemployed from other companies. So this is a great time to rethink about how the standard business is being done. The second thing that I think has come out of this is a lot of these small companies are going to be financially challenged. And this has been an opportunity for InnovaHealth, which has lots of dry powder, to step in and look at a whole series of companies with a great opportunity to invest in those and bring them forward. So I think the Medtech companies have been very nimble. They have been thinking new ways to approach the marketing and the supply of their technologies across the board. So I think this has been a great opportunity for InnovaHealth, and I think that's also going to have people who are very interested in looking at new technologies to begin to address the new markets of outpatient and minimally invasive.
Great. Let's talk about leadership for a couple of minutes here. I love to really understand your thinking about where you've seen it applied in organizations well, and where you've seen it fail, especially over the months just past with the pandemic.
Well, Tim, when I started out as CEO, I did not realize the importance of leadership. and I completely changed my mind over this time. I've seen it now where the leader of a hospital, a leader of a ward, a leader of a department, and if in fact you put the proper people in place and there you can change a failing organization or a failing portion of an organization to very successful in a matter of weeks. And it's really stunning the importance of great leadership. Now, leadership is now challenged in a way that it hasn't been before in these crises. One of the things that's quite clear, and is particularly increasingly clear when you get into a crisis, is that people want to be led. They want to have a opportunity to be effective, and they need to come together with a plan put together by a leader who's going to tell them that plan. The plan has to be decisive, and that's hard to do in a crisis because information is incomplete, and you have big decisions to make, but you have to be very clear about those decisions. Quite interestingly, you need to talk, you're talking to people you're leading, and you need to talk to them about the them and not about the finances. It's about people. And that's an important thing to remember when you're dealing with this. And finally, you need to define reality for people. There's a tremendous amount of rumors and concerns and anxiety that goes into any crisis. And if you are really straightforward, you get the facts right, you give them unvarnished facts, and you define this as a challenge and not as a disaster that has to be endured, then they will rally to this, whatever your cause is and your direction. You have to give people reasonable reasons for hope and a plan on how you're going to go forward. And it's amazing how people respond. I think one point that probably is worth emphasizing here is that we're dealing not with an economic crisis or a a medical crisis. We're also dealing with a crisis of anxiety. And every place you go, regardless of who you talk with, there is tremendous anxiety. And that affects people in multiple ways. It affects how they think, how clearly they think. It affects them whether they're thinking about the short term versus the long term. And the people who are going to have the advantage coming out of this are people who dealt with but also planned for the long term going forward. And I think that leaders can take advantage of this with a decisive plan, define reality, and give people hope and a long-term plan. And companies that do that are going to be very successful coming out of this.
Yeah. We've seen it time and time again, just with our companies and those they compete with, that we can really see where the investment in leadership, strong leadership, and people with vision and integrity can really keep people focused on not just short-term goals, but the long-term. And it's been a very effective and exciting thing to see people in action under these challenges.
Tim, let me just add one thing that I think is incredibly important is communication. And the leaders need to communicate continuously. And you have to remember that everybody receives their information differently. Some people get it in webinars, some people get it in person, some people get it with emails, some people read it in the newspaper. But the consistency and the importance of frequent communication can't be emphasized. You have to get the word out repeatedly if you're going to lead through a difficult crisis. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do here today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, let's turn to something you said at the very beginning, which is the virus is here to stay. What in addition to, I guess, the vaccine being the first milestone, what events should we hope to see occur that would tell us that virus is subsiding to the level of, say, a SARS or the more common flu?
Well, I think we're going to see continuing decrease in the activity. I think as we reopen, we're going to see hotspots that are going to have to be dealt with testing. And unfortunately, testing is not the answer to all of this, because it will help define when someone has a disease or doesn't, if you test them, they're maybe negative today and positive tomorrow. So it's a spot in time. It will not, widespread testing will not in and of itself totally eliminate this disease.
Yeah.
I hope that we eventually get to serologic testing that will tell us whether people have been exposed and are immune. So far, we do not have that, but we do not know when we do have it how long the immunity will last and whether we're going to have vaccinations on a regular basis. Much like tetanus, that some has to be done every several years, and flu needs to be done on an annual basis. By the way, I think it's important that people understand that you should really emphasize the importance of flu shots as we go forward, because the flu is going to come back in the fall, just like it does every year. And many people across the United States do not get their flu shots, and mortality from that alone is about 50,000 people a year in the United States. So well worth emphasizing the importance for everybody to have their flu shots.
Terrific. I should add here that the last question and going forward are questions from the audience, and we would welcome to take more. Just again, as Tiffany mentioned at the beginning, please just hit the chat box and we'll be able to present these questions. Let's get back to one that has come up. Earlier, you had talked about procedures being about what procedures were possibly candidates for outpatient or ambulatory surgery center settings as opposed to hospitals. And what specifically were you envisioning moving in that direction? What are the areas that already are in those settings? What further minimally invasive surgeries do you expect to be obvious ones that we should see moving out of the hospitals?
Well, let's think about why we're moving out of the hospitals. First of all, people are nervous about coming to the hospital. Secondly, by doing patients and outpatients, it is a less expensive location to do it. And thirdly, as we have more minimally invasive procedures, it's possible to move more people out. And finally, I think things are going to move from the hospital to outpatient to ultimately to home care. So let's, and you've seen this already with joint replacements. In orthopedics, you've certainly seen a number of GI procedures. Certainly, many of the diagnoses are no longer require coming to the hospital. Why would anybody need to come to the hospital, for example, to get their blood pressure taken or their glucose monitored? Those are all things that can be done remotely, and as tests and procedures are more available online or remotely, I think less and less people are going to need to come to the hospital. Now, let's take one example that I think for cancer, for example. People now come to cancer centers for the chemotherapy. I think ultimately that's going to be done at home. I think that you're going to see a number of things done with telemedicine. I think dermatology is a great example of this. Psychiatry certainly is going to follow in the same direction. Anything that does not require hands-on or very expensive technology is a candidate for moving out of the hospital into outpatient facilities or into homes.
So, what are the specific areas you are seeing as best primed for growth based on COVID? And how does the sort of democratization of healthcare play into these themes?
Well, I clearly this is going to put a big emphasis on healthcare and science, and that we haven't seen emphasized in this way for a long time. I think people now realize that the answer to a pandemic is healthcare and public health, and so I think there'll be great emphasis on this. And to get right down to the nitty gritty of it, telehealth is clearly going to expand. And I think that goes under the heading of democratization of healthcare. I think you now have seen a number of companies starting into the pharmaceutical prescribing, which is again a step in the democratization of healthcare. Think about how these things bring care to people who are in remote areas, who are housebound, who don't have access to a regular physician. There are enormous opportunities to do this, and I think we're going to see many companies continue to do this, and just like you've seen startups doing psychiatry, all of these things are going to change the face of delivery of healthcare.
Here's a question that's come in dealing with the question of going to hospitals today. How do you reassure people that they're not putting themselves at risk of contracting the virus when they actually need to go to a hospital for any reason?
Well, hospitals have clearly changed how they respond. For example, you get temperature checked on everybody who comes in the morning, all the employees. Everybody's wearing a mask. No visitors are coming to the hospitals. There is incredible emphasis on keeping things clean across the entire organization. In fact, there's not one caregiver at the Cleveland Clinic who's gotten COVID from the Cleveland Clinic from their care of looking after patients, etc. Right. So we've learned how to take care of patients successfully, and I think that hospitals are now safe, and you see less crowding of waiting rooms, emergency rooms, people being diverted in two directions in an emergency room. One for potential infections with COVID and others for standard diseases. I think hospitals have done a very good job of this and recognizing the various steps that need to be taken. I'm just concerned that if people do not get their regular health care, we're going to see a big bump in mortality rate across multiple diseases.
Yeah. Toby, what are the steps being taken, in your view, to adapt resources to prepare for the next pandemic? We're obviously focused on this pandemic heavily, but given the risks that we now are aware of future pandemics, what are the steps that you believe are going to be most effective in trying to be better prepared?
No question, we are a world community now. And with transportation now going, with people moving around the world and products moving around the world with the speed at which they do, I think any disease can move at the same speed. So this is going to require a international monitoring and collaboration amongst countries, recognizing that when a hotspot is developed someplace else, the world must be aware of it and try to figure out how we contain it. We live in a world ripe with viruses, and some of them are going to be very potent. But short of monitoring this and being alert and managing to try and control their spread as various things, I think that we will have the potential for the same sort of major catastrophe as we witnessed over the last several months.
Well, hopefully we'll have a systematic approach towards building stockpiles of protective gear, et cetera, and and provide incremental budgeting for public health focused on this
Yes,
within the
but
CDC or otherwise.
yeah, but I don't expect to see the world globalization of the world change. We are too independent now. The transportation is too good, and I don't think we're going to see. Manufacturing is always going to seek the cheapest place to do it, and globalization is not going to go away.
Yeah, it's a very important point. Let's talk a little bit about one point you mentioned earlier was that you see some changes in the FDA regulatory world. Do you think it's going to become one of our audience is asking, is it going to improve, meaning allow for faster access to markets for medtech companies? Is that what you're implying here?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think there's been tremendous pressure on the FDA, and they've responded in multiple different ways. I think there's going to be, because of their rapid approval of some things, I think there'll be some mistakes, and some things that will have to be changed after that. But no question, they've now realized that they can move faster than they ever did before. This is a big opportunity. I hope they take advantage of it. And we'll have to continue to remind them that they did pretty well when they shortened the time.
Yes. We've also been asked about the use of debt facilities in this environment and in the financing of our investments or other firms' investments in medtech, given the access to debt markets and the inexpensive cost of capital. And let me just take take that question, Toby. We clearly emphasize and almost exclusively finance our companies with equity. These are high growth businesses. We believe that debt payments, no matter how low, and principal, no matter how low the interest rates are, still involve debt repayment after 3 or 4 or 5 years. We would prefer, and there certainly are significant opportunities to borrow money, but we really equitize our investments at the start to allow for all available cash flow to be directed towards growth, expansion of products, expansion of development of those products, expansion of markets and distributions. In the first several years, we clearly focus on an all equity structure. After several years, and often in the last year of a particular investment horizon for a deal, we consider some sort of debt. We can consider some sort of debt facility, but it again has to be dependent on the company's projections and overall capital needs. We don't want to get in a trap where you've had to leverage if you would, where you've leveraged the company's balance sheet and inhibited its ability to grow, especially as you move towards an exit of any kind. So one has to do that very judiciously. Another question I'd love to get back to you, Toby, on is really what your sense is about WHO and China telling the truth about pandemics, and whether there's a real story there that we should be waiting to emerge.
Well, first of all, I think China has not given us the full picture right off the bat, and I was surprised at this, having good relationships with many of the physicians who know China very well. The second part about the World Health Organization, it's difficult to sort out fact from fiction regarding what the World Health Organization has done. I believe in the fact that we need to have an organization such as the World Health Organization. How well they have performed, I'm not sure I can testify, but I think it's important that we have an organization like that. I think only time and retrospect will tell us how accurate they were, but I believe in the importance of having that sort of oversight organization. Includes the entire world, and I don't think anything could bring it more clearly to mind than the pandemic and its rapid spread across the world.
Yeah. In any insights on the rumors or and suggestions that certain producers in China have been told not to manufacture in PPE or pharma that is or that they have been told or they've been allowed to sell defective PPE and defective devices and other pharma ingredients?
I only have information about what you and I and all of us read in the newspaper. I have no firsthand information that would be useful to pass on.
Okay. Question relating to your comments about the financial strain that hospitals are under. What is going to be their approach towards incorporating new medical technologies and innovation as they are under financial pressure?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's very appropriate. And I think that they're going to be looking for something that is A, a new source of income, or B, more efficient in how the care is delivered, or C, something that can expedite the move out of the hospital into more outpatient facilities. So I think those are the parameters that people are going to look for. I think that is where Medtech is probably going to be most easily sold into the healthcare delivery system.
So once again, innovation, innovation, innovation. I think we are going to turn now as we're at the end of our period. Actually, I have one other question I'm dying to talk to you about and get your answer on from one of our members of the audience here. And how do you feel sort of medical technology companies will best be able to introduce and train physicians to new technologies, and can reps still be in procedures?
I think that's
in many of the markets.
Yeah, I think reps are not going to be in procedures the way we were in the past. And I think that there's going to be more and more webinars, more virtual teaching. And I think you can reach bigger groups that way more rapidly. And just about 15 years ago, I participated in demonstrating new surgical procedures in 5 continents at 40 sites simultaneously from Cleveland. The power of this technology has been available for a long time, and I think now the impetus is going to be to use
it. Seems very. It's certainly something we're seeing embraced very fully by the surgeon community around the world, with webinars in Hong Kong being watched in the States, and ones in Los Angeles being watched in Europe or wherever. It's just becoming a standard practice.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would like to do at this time, I hate to draw this to a close, but I'd like to thank you, Toby, very much for working with us on this collaboration, and I hope our audience has felt it was worthwhile. I particularly felt our discussion about organizational leadership and the delivery of healthcare to settings other than hospitals to be very telling. And also the discussion on the importance of obviously of innovation to hospitals delivering care and what their focus and priorities are going to be. Tiffany, thank you very much, Toby. Tiffany, anything else you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you, Tim. As mentioned earlier, we will make a recording of this webcast available to our investors, advisors, and management partners. And we want to thank you, Dr. Cosgrove, and thank you, Tim, for the insights into medical technology innovation and growth during the era of the pandemic. We thank you all for joining, and we look forward to being in close touch. Stay safe.